Okay, perfect. So, welcome to today's session, hosted and set up by Pre-Law Shadowers. I'm Reshma, and I'll be the coordinator for today's session. Today, I'll be talking to the lawyer Lauren M. Wilhelm about her career and path into law. I'll let Lauren introduce herself in just a minute, but to give you a rundown of today's session, Lauren will be talking to us today about her career, and I'll be asking some of the questions I've had prepared. Um, but I'll start with an introduction of myself, tell you a little bit about Pre-Law Shadowers, and then hand it off to you. So my name, as I mentioned, is Reshma Acer. I'm an incoming fourth year student at U of T studying Ethics, Society, and Law and Linguistics. I'm currently studying for the LSAT and plan on taking it sometime next year before hopefully applying to law school. That said, I'm really interested in the legal field and hearing about others' journeys into law school and working in law. So I'm really excited to host today's session. I'm an exec member of Pre-Law Shadowers who set up today's meeting. Pre-Law Shadowers is a student-led organization dedicated to providing pre-law students across universities in Ontario with virtual shadowing opportunities. Our goal is to help young students engage and learn more about the legal careers they plan to pursue. It can be difficult to find learning opportunities during the pandemic, so we started this organization in the hopes that it can be both accessible and educationally fulfilling for students. So today we'll be talking about Lauren, as I mentioned, a lawyer in the field of Canadian criminal law. Lauren represents clients in all kinds of proceedings in the Ontario Court of Justice, Superior Court of Justice, and the Court of Appeal for Ontario. She started off her career with an undergraduate degree in criminal justice and public policy in the University of Guelph and attended law at Windsor Law. She was involved in a few extracurriculars also relating to criminal law and got the opportunity to be a judicial law clerk before starting her practice as a criminal defense lawyer. We're really excited to have her here with us today so she can tell us more about her experiences and her path into the legal field. So welcome, Lauren. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, you can.
Sure. Thanks very much, Reshma. My name is Lauren Wilhelm. I am a criminal lawyer in Hamilton, Ontario. You've heard a little bit about how I got here, but I'm a member of a small firm. There's three of us, myself and a junior associate. Hamilton is a fairly busy city center, no shortage of criminal activity, so it's a good place to practice. I've been here at this firm for the duration of my career as a lawyer, with the exception of 1 year while I was completing a clerkship at the Court of Appeal. And my practice is and always has been exclusively criminal defense.
So thank you for that introduction. We'll now be jumping into the questions that we've prepared for today. So to start with, what programs and courses did you study in your undergraduate program, and why did you pick what you chose to study before law?
So I actually went into undergrad not necessarily with a view to being a lawyer. In fact, I thought I was going to be a dietitian. I started out at the University of Guelph in their applied human nutrition program. Didn't really enjoy it after the first year, but kind of thought, well, you can't quit after 1 year. You've got to give it a shot. So I did 2 years in that program before deciding this isn't for me. Didn't really know at that point what I would ultimately end up doing, but I switched my major to criminal justice and public policy. That's the degree I ended up obtaining from the University of Guelph. After that, sort of by chance, because oftentimes, some of you may learn, there's not all that much you can do with an undergraduate degree unless it's highly specialized. So it's not that I couldn't find work, but I ended up working at a law firm by chance, doing clerk work in the real estate department. That may be some people's cup of tea, but it wasn't mine. It was a way to pay the bills and make money. And frankly, after undergrad, I was ready to be in the workforce in any event. So I worked for about 3 years before I got to a point where I kind of thought to myself, you know what, this isn't challenging. There's only so far I can go in this particular field without pursuing a further education. And law school had been something I kind of considered in my younger years, but never really had definitively put on the plate as something I was going to do. But I guess perhaps in some ways being exposed to the legal field and also realizing I have an interest in these things, but I need to do more if I want to end up with a career where I'm stimulated and making a good income. And that sort of spurred me on to apply to law school, which I did, got in and ended up where I am now.
Interesting. That is a really interesting path because, as you mentioned, you started off as a dietitian or studying in that field. And I think that's a really interesting path that you took. So how is the LSAT for you? And what was the law school admission process like? Do you have any advice for students currently taking the LSAT or applying right now?
So we're going back a number of years at this point, so I don't know how much it's changed, but I think I can probably offer some general tips that I suspect are probably still worthwhile, even though it may be a little bit different game at this stage in time. As far as the LSAT goes, back when I was doing it, I think there was a bit of debate amongst people of, do you take the prep courses? What's the best way to prepare? And I think I'll say first and foremost that it's probably an individualized question. What worked for me may or may not work for the next person, but if you know your learning style, I think you can take what you will from what I'm about to say. I did do one of the prep courses. I think it was helpful. But I also think if you're someone who's a self-learner, it's not really necessary. I think the most helpful thing I did to prepare for the LSAT was just repeatedly doing practice exams and trying to do them and mimic them as closely as possible in terms of the actual conditions. So that didn't necessarily mean sitting for a 6-hour block of time and writing a whole practice test, but doing the sections under timing constraints. Because when it came down to writing the test, again, at least in my experience or what I recall of it, the biggest challenge isn't having the capacity to answer the questions. The biggest challenge is having the capacity to answer the questions under the time and stress constraints that you'll be under when you do it. Yeah. So I think if you prepare for one thing, it's really preparing for those conditions, both the timing. There's not so much you can necessarily do to prepare for the mental stress other than knowing what you're getting into. But preparing for the timing, I think, is really key. Because I think anyone who's gotten to the point of writing the LSAT obviously is a smart person. You've completed or are about to complete an undergraduate degree. You obviously have the skills to do well, but the real sort of place where the rubber meets the road is if you can do well under those pressure conditions. As far as the application process to law school goes, I'll confess I don't have any great memory of anything in particular that I did or didn't do that probably made a difference one way or the other. My recollection, and again, I appreciate that this may have changed over time, was that the applications were slightly different from school to school, and there were slightly different things that each school might have been looking for in terms of the kind of students they wanted to attract or what they might look for in a personal statement. And so I guess what I would say in a general sense, if that continues to be the case, really do your research about the schools that you're applying to. Anything you write in a personal statement, I think, should always sort of show who you are as opposed to trying to be something that the school wants, because you can put it through sort of put yourself through the lens of, what you think the qualities you have that the school is looking for and sort of highlight those things. But I think it's a mistake to try and write your essay or write your statement to be someone you're not, to try and fit the mold. I think that's probably transparent when you get to the people that are reviewing things. I think at the end of the day, and I'll probably repeat that sentiment in other answers down the road, but I think a lot of what you will go on to do as a lawyer, if you ultimately pursue that career, you really have to find your own strengths, your own skill set, and your own style of doing things. And I think that can start right at the application process when you're trying to sort of present that best self in those portions of the applications.
Thank you. That was a really good answer. That was very helpful. Which law school? We did briefly talk about the fact that you went to Windsor Law, but why did you choose Windsor Law, and how was your experience there?
So to be perfectly honest, I chose Windsor Law because they chose me. As I said at the outset, when I was an undergrad, I wasn't necessarily on track to pursue a career in law. I did really well academically in my last 2 years, but my first 2 years, I would say I was living life and learning about life more than learning about my courses. So I didn't have bad grades or a bad average, but I also wasn't the absolute top tier of applicants. I applied to all 6 Ontario schools, or at least there were 6 back then. Windsor was where I got in, so Windsor was where I went. Having said that, even though it wasn't necessarily a choice that I made insofar as they chose me instead of the other way around, it's a path and a route that I'm absolutely happy it ended up going that way. I think I got a great education at the University of Windsor. I think the school, I mean, it's hard to compare. You go to one school, you'll only hear anecdotally from other people what their experiences are like. But in my experience at Windsor, it's a community-minded school. There's a real feel for social justice. You get to know your colleagues, you get to know your professors. You can be as involved as you want to be, and really, develop those relationships if you choose to do so. I think one of the things people get hung up on, one in terms of applying to law school, and also a little bit further down the road when you're looking towards employment. I think law, probably more than other professions, we've got some ideas of, what's a prestige school, or what's a prestige job, or what's a prestige area of law to pursue. And it's fair to have those perceptions. I think a lot of us, or many of us, do to a certain extent, but you get to realize once you get to law school or you get into the workforce, nobody cares where you went to law school. In fact, nobody even cares what your grades are after a certain point. It's going to come down to if you're competent, capable, and do well at your job. So don't get hung up on sort of, I want to go to a particular school because of their reputation. I would say, to the extent that you can, and as it happened to me, maybe you go where you get in. But any law school in Ontario is going to give you a great education. You'll get out of it what you put into it. And at the end of the day, the degree is the degree. You pass the bar, you pass the bar. You're called to the bar, you're called to the bar, and everybody's equal on the other end of things, other than your skill set. So don't get too hung up on that. And you may surprise yourself ending up somewhere and realizing, this is actually a really good fit. So if you're in the privileged position of being the top student and having the absolute choice of any and all schools to go to, I would say give some thought to who you accept and what's actually the best fit for you, whether that's in terms of your personal life circumstances, whether it's in terms of geography, whether it's in terms of sort of the culture of the school. And I would say that should almost be more of a stronger factor in your choice, if you have one, than sort of picking on the basis of, well, if I choose this school, it's going to bode well for me down the road.
Thank you. Were there any courses or professors or school clubs that stood out to you in your time at Windsor Law?
So the one thing, and again, I'm a criminal lawyer, but I've always, even from the time I went into law school, known that if I was going to do law, it was going to be criminal law. So after the first year, where everybody's taking the same courses, I tried to the extent possible, choose courses that focused on criminal law or evidence or these kinds of things in large measure. But having said that, regardless of the discipline of law, I think there's probably more opportunities in terms of certain areas than others. But one thing I would urge students to do when you get there is take at least one sort of practical type course. So for example, and I think most law schools have this, Windsor, we had a community legal clinic. We had several actually, but the one that you can volunteer, and you can also do a semester where you're actually getting credits for spending significant time at the clinic and having a more supervisory role. So I would urge anybody to take advantage, especially if you want to pursue a career in litigation, to take advantage of whatever clinical opportunities your school might present. Because I can tell you now, being a practicing lawyer, the stuff you learn in law school, sitting in a class, writing an exam, reading a textbook, that's going to be your foundation. You need that knowledge. You absolutely do. but putting it into practice is again sort of really where the two sides come together. And that's what the steepest learning curve is once you actually become a lawyer, is learning the sort of the practice of law, how to deal with people, how to behave in a courtroom, how to file things. From the small to the big, the practical end of it is really, I think, for most people, the biggest learning curve when you start working as a lawyer. And I think the experiences I pursued at law school in terms of the clinics really gave me a different comfort level when I did start practicing, because I had, albeit not fulsome experience that a lawyer would have, I did have some experience with clients and with courts and with procedure. And even if that didn't make me ready to land on my feet and be off to the races entirely, I think it gave me a leg up on people who may not have had that experience.
You did mention that you've always known you wanted to do criminal law. Why did you choose this field? What connects you to the field of criminal law?
Sure. So for me, first and foremost, I knew that if I was going to pursue a career as a lawyer, I wanted to be a litigator. And criminal law, especially I think in 2022, is one of the few areas of law where there is still a consistent litigation practice. So civil litigators, there's a lot of things that resolve. There's a lot of negotiation. It's not that we don't do some of that stuff as criminal lawyers, but everything we do, even if it ends up in a negotiated resolution, a guilty plea, along every step of the way towards that end or towards a trial, we're in court all the time. And so for me, that was a very attractive feature because I knew I wanted that sort of aspect of a legal career. Secondarily, the subject material, to me, it's always just been fascinating. Criminal law, I don't want to say more so than any other field, because I think family law is probably another area where you're also very much dealing with people. But criminal law definitely has a significant part of the job where what you do is definitely legal work, but it's also almost social work in a sense. You're dealing with real people, you're dealing with real problems, you're trying to find solutions, you're seeing, aspects of human psychology that, at least personally, I find fascinating. So it's a really great mix of the academic end of things, the hands-on end of things, and it's a very people-oriented area of practice.
Interesting. What do you dislike most about this field, if anything?
Well, I guess I would say I wouldn't necessarily say it's that I dislike it, but it certainly is a very it's a very high stress area of law, and for some of the reasons that also make it an area that I really love. So the fact that you're constantly in court, the fact that you're dealing, it's not that money isn't important or that stakes aren't high when you're dealing with someone's money in some sort of a civil claim or something along those lines, but you're literally dealing with people's lives day in, day out. And so it's a stressful area of practice. You have to have a thick skin. You have to, know yourself and know how to sort of balance, your own mental well-being while still, taking on a lot of the stress of clients and family members and the stress of wanting to perform.
Interesting. What is a typical day like at your firm? How do the services that your clients might require from you differ?
So I'll perhaps start by answering that question with kind of an overview of the journey of a file. So somebody is charged with a crime. Sometimes the very day that they're arrested at the police station, they're calling a lawyer. When you're arrested, you're either going to be released from the police station with a court date and with conditions that you have to obey, or they'll hold you for a bail hearing where, with the assistance of a lawyer, you have to demonstrate to a court that you should be released and on what conditions. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's the gist of it. And so usually we are having people come to us either at the stage where they need a bail hearing or after they've been released and they have an upcoming court date. That upcoming court date is not their trial, it's not their plea date, but it starts a process in the criminal court, which will, in most cases, end either in a guilty plea or end in a trial. And so the life of the file goes on in between. So a typical day for a criminal lawyer, for myself or my colleagues, could involve any one of those steps along the life of a criminal file. So most mornings we're in court. These days, this particular court is virtual, but we're in what we call a remand court, which is a court where people appear every several weeks to sort of check in while their case moves along to a stage where they're ready to set a date for a guilty plea or they're ready to set a date for a trial. So that's usually the first thing we do in the morning. And then if it's a day where we have actual substantive matters happening, like guilty pleas, like trials, like preliminary hearings, those courts usually start at 10. So we might, if you have a trial, you're going to be most likely gone for the day, and however many other days that week it's scheduled for. Guilty pleas are usually shorter affairs, but again, it's all a matter of being on a list and timing and waiting your turn. So if it's a day where we've got substantive things in court, that would sort of be the next thing along the way. Or some days we're in and out of the office, and if it's an office day, the phone could be ringing with new clients or with clients calling about questions on their files. We'd be doing sort of the background work in the life of a file, things like reviewing disclosure, writing letters to clients or to Crowns about issues in the case, sometimes preparing application materials. Often, or most afternoons, we do our appointments, usually in the later half of the afternoon, one, to accommodate our court schedule, and two, to try and accommodate clients as best we can. And those could be anything from initial intake meetings, so we're meeting clients for the first time, or meetings along the way to discuss steps in the file or to prepare for trial or whatever phase the case may be at.
Interesting. Are there any kinds of cases that appear more commonly than others? Or are there any cases that specifically stood out to you the most?
So in terms of, as criminal lawyers, we handle anything and everything in the criminal code. So everything from, stealing a chocolate bar to murder and everything in between. I think the most common offenses, I don't have statistics on this is anecdotal, but we get a lot of low-level domestic cases. So domestic assaults between partners. When I say low level, I often mean people who don't have a criminal record. There's been some sort of fight, somebody got pushed or shoved or hit. That's not to justify domestic violence. Please don't take that the wrong way, but in a scheme of things, I'm talking about things that come on the lower end of the scale. So there's a large amount of those. There's a large amount of impaired driving. There's a large amount of sex assaults, far more now than there ever has been. And that could be a whole separate debate as to the reasons for that, but that's a significant amount of the practice. Smaller amount of cases like murders and manslaughters. One, because there's only so many of those you can take on at a time, because those cases tend to run for weeks or months on end. So if you're going to have a practice that balances a number of different types of criminal files, once you get past a certain number of large scale cases, it's hard to balance the other clients that you've got to give your attention to. And I'd say a fair number of drug cases as well.
Interesting. This is a sort of a lighter question, but what is a common misconception about lawyers that you hear the most?
So I'm going to focus on criminal lawyers just because that's what I do. And I think the biggest misconception people have about criminal lawyers is all we do is try and get guilty people off. And they see, if they don't know much about law or much about the discipline, they see the work of criminal defense lawyers as really just trying to have people escape punishment. And I think that's a huge misconception. I know a large part of what we do as criminal defense lawyers is in fact trying to find solutions. So there's a a good portion of cases that do go to trial, and they go to trial either because the person is innocent, or they have a legal defense, or they maintain their innocence. And in any of those circumstances, in any circumstance, they're presumed innocent. It's up to the state to prove to the contrary. But beyond that, I would say the majority of probably most criminal practices is resolving cases. And when I say resolving, I mean things that end in a guilty plea or something short thereof, where our role is really to help people try and get the best solution possible in the circumstances. So any given offense, there's always going to be a range of appropriate penalty. Where an individual person falls in that range is going to be a function of what they've done and the circumstances of that, but also their personal circumstances. And you can imagine, you know, we deal with all types of people, all spectrum of people. And there's a lot of different reasons that people end up finding themselves in conflict with the criminal law. So most of what we do is actually working towards a resolution, working towards a plea or an acceptance of responsibility, but trying to do so in a way to help the person in a way that that ends in the best possible outcome that it can for them.
Interesting. What advice would you give to your younger self prior to attending law school?
I think what I would perhaps say to my younger self, even going back farther than just before entering law school, I would start perhaps at the point of entering undergrad. As I said at the very beginning of our conversation, I went into undergrad thinking that I was on one certain path, and there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes when you know, you know. But I think, and I ultimately came to this conclusion, but I think I would tell my younger self or similarly situated people that life sometimes doesn't go in the way that you think that you've planned it, and that's okay. And it's okay to switch courses. It's okay to be open to opportunity. And I think, in fact, being open to those possibilities, not being tied to a certain goal with blinders on to anything else, can actually be helpful to getting you where you need to go and where you'll be successful.
Okay, last question. But what advice would you give to the next generation of aspiring lawyers?
So I think I'll come back here to something I touched on earlier. And I think the best advice I can give to aspiring lawyers is be true to yourself. This is a profession where, you know, we've got a lot of big names, big egos, intelligent, highly talented people. And you can and should learn from anyone and everyone, from the best lawyer you've ever heard of to perhaps the guy or gal or person who's not the greatest. You can learn from everyone. And you should take in as much information and as much experience as you can. But I think you should never try to be somebody else. You should never try to be Marie Henein, if that's your idol. And I think Marie Henein is a fabulous lawyer. And there's lots you can learn from watching someone like her or any other well-known successful person you can think of. But I think where people go wrong is where they try to mold themselves into that person as opposed to following their own strengths, their own personality. Lawyering in particular, there's lots of ways to do this job. If we're talking about litigators, there's lots of styles. We're not all the same. And I think if you're wanting to be a lawyer, dedicate yourself to the work. It's a hard job. It's a tough job. It takes some dedication, and it takes some thick skin. And strive to be well, strive to be successful, but do it on your own terms.
Okay. Well, thank you for that advice. That is it for my list of questions, and thank you so much. Do you have any questions for us?
I don't think I have any questions for you guys, but I'm more than happy. I'm sure you have my contact information. If there is anybody out there that I'm probably, because it's been a while since I've been involved in the application process, I may not be the best person to answer your questions about that. But if there are people out there who have questions about the practice of law or about criminal law in particular, I'm more than happy to chat one-on-one or to answer emails if you send them to me. So by all means, feel free to share my contact information. And if people have things they want to talk about outside of this chat, I'm more than happy to do that.
Okay. Well, it was really nice meeting you, and thank you so much for being here today and for answering all the questions we had. Thank you. That's
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
okay. Bye.
Bye.